Okay, welcome to the third intro video, and what we're looking at is the URLs that we left you with on the last one that will help you with evolution. And I'm sure you realized how important evolution is from the last couple of videos to inform us as biologists and also to be able to pass this class. Okay, so we're going to move on now and look at the life histories of marine invertebrates. Okay, so a lot of marine invertebrate animals share the same, some of the same characteristics, and that's because of the environment they live in. You'll find that many of them are what we call broadcast spawners, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But this is a good reproductive strategy for an aquatic environment. And so we want to have a look at the shared characteristics. All right, we know what it's like to be a land animal. We are land animals. We know what it's like to move through the air. We know what plants are like trees and bushes. We know how other animals move and eat and what it's like to do that because we are terrestrial animals. But to know what it's like to live in the water, we actually have to stop and think about some of the physical characteristics of living in the water. A lot of it's common sense, but it's things like this. Okay, you're going to have this horrible accident like this because the air is not very viscous and it's not very dense compared to seawater. So you're never going to have a fall like this with a physical. You're not going to get a broken bone falling through the water. So the density of seawater is 800 times that of air, which means that a lot of things that will sink to the ground in air will float in the water. Okay, a lot of this is common sense, but that's because of the density. The molecules of H2O, of water, are that much closer together than air molecules. Okay, and viscosity of seawater, 60 times that of air. So much lower sinking rates, which means, and viscosity is just the measure of a substance and its resistance to deforming. So if you try to move through air or through water, you are pushing that water or air, that medium, out of the way as you move through it, and you have to make that deform, that stable medium deform. It's very simple to imagine what viscosity is. If you imagine pouring water or pouring golden syrup onto your pancakes, the water is going to pour much more easily. The syrup is going to pour a lot more slowly. The syrup is much more viscous. And if you imagine trying to swim through a pool filled with syrup, then you can imagine how slow you'd be moving. And that has to do with viscosity. Okay. Desiccation. Desiccation means drying out. All right. In the water, you don't have to worry about if you live in the water column, you don't have to worry about drying out. All land creatures do worry about drying out, and so henceforth we have lots of adaptations, like our skin, like having eggs that carry their own water supply with a shell that holds the water inside. And so us land animals and plants as well have lots of adaptations to hold on to water because it's a precious resource. And so that's not going to be an issue in marine invertebrates. Okay, so physical differences. Water carries an abundance of nutrients. Okay, so air does not carry a lot of nutrients. We have to go ahead and eat and ingest our nutrients, whereas water. See, these people who are wrestling in the spaghetti, looking like they're having a lot of fun. So if they were in the water, they might be able to just absorb those nutrients, whereas as a terrestrial organism, we've got to go and find our way to these nutrients and eat them. Okay, so the food is all around you in the water, whereas it's in just sort of discrete packages in the terrestrial environment. Okay. Physical differences, temperature fluctuation. Okay, like you can see these two extremes between the Antarctic, which can get down to 80, 90 degrees below zero, and then you've got 50, around 45 or 50 degrees above zero in desert conditions. And so we've got wide varieties of temperature, and also big changes in the same environment. Okay, so from winter to summer. Okay, it could have huge ranges of temperatures. When I was where I lived in upstate New York, we'd occasionally get 100 Fahrenheit, and we'd get 40 below, 42 below is the coldest I remember Fahrenheit, which is essentially 40 below. That would be between 35 in the summer and 40 below in the winter in upstate New York. And so you get wide temperature changes in that one habitat, and the organisms that live there have to be able to deal with all of those conditions in order to survive from one year to the next. Okay, whereas in a deep sea marine environment, you might have a temperature that stays at 4 degrees Celsius for hundreds, or if not thousands, of years. So always exactly the same, no light, and very, very stable temperature. So what do you think? Is more energy required to raise air temperatures or water temperatures? Okay, I think you know the answer. Air temperatures fluctuate much more quickly, and water temperatures, whereas on land here in Tauranga, we might have 12 or 13 in the morning, and then 28 in the middle of the afternoon, but the seawater temperature might change 2 or 3 degrees on the surface, the very surface layers, but the underlying water might stay at 20 degrees all day long. So very low fluctuation in temperature in marine environments. Okay, so in terms of reproduction, terrestrial versus marine, how do land organisms reproduce? Okay, well, they mostly reproduce like we do. Most land animals reproduce, most land organisms reproduce sexually. Let's qualify that by saying those large organisms, because as we know, bacteria and viruses will outnumber us by the thousands or millions to one, and so the most successful and the most numerous organisms are going to be the microbial organisms like bacteria. But if we think about larger organisms like animals and plants, how do they reproduce? Well, most of them reproduce sexually, and most animals reproduce by copulation, of course. So, but what about aquatic organisms? Do most of them copulate? Well, no. Most of them, what they do is broadcast spawn, and most of them have planktonic larvae. So what they'll do is they'll create a larva that swims around or floats around in the plankton and goes and lives somewhere away from the adult. So it's not competing necessarily with the same adult for the nutrients in that area, or for that precious space to colonize. So they'll produce a larva, and then just broadcast it out into the water column and let it float away, and hopefully it finds a place to settle. And they do have some interesting means of finding ways to settle. They're not just necessarily just at the mercy of currents. So let's have a look at these two planktonic larvae. Okay, the first one is the week-old larva of a polychaete worm, Owenia coloris. And the second one, and so you can see, we'll talk about that in a second. This one is a coronate larva of a Bugula species, which is a bryozoan, okay, a very, very small organism. And you can see this has a little cilia on it. This is to help it move around. This one also is got these little tentacles that can help it move, and little cilia along here that can help it move. So these are involved in feeding and movement, and these little cilia that are actually not very clear help this thing move. So these things actually can direct their movement a little bit, and they are partly at the movement of the currents. Interestingly, if you want to study larvae, you can do a lot. You can study marine larvae with bryozoans quite easily, because if you get a bryozoan colony and you brood it in, you put it in a tank and you keep it in the dark, and then you expose it to light, they'll generally release heaps of these offspring, these oocytes. Okay, and so you can see actually the two little eye spots in these Bugula species, and these things are light sensitive. They can detect which direction light is coming from. And so these things are actually quite complex, and but this is how most marine invertebrates reproduce. They just throw their eggs and sperm up into the water column and hope they find each other, and then that they are able to settle. Now let me just also point out a couple of differences here. This one, it's a round egg. It's got a couple of eye spots, and the organism sort of on the inside, but it's got like eggs that we eat. It has a yolk sac. It's got yolk in there that provides it a lot of nutrients. Whereas this one, you can see a digestive column, or a digestive digestive system that means that this one is feeding as it's being dispersed. Okay, so this one takes a lot more energy for the parent to produce. This one, they produce millions and millions of these little larvae and just hope that they can find enough food, and so their strategy is to produce vast numbers. Okay, this is its gut. Okay, and so you can see the difference between the two. These ones are called lecithotrophic. Okay, and these ones are called planktotrophic. Troph means eating. Okay, planktotrophic means ingesting plankton, and lecithotrophic, lecitho is egg, and so that means that it is ingesting the yolk from the egg. Okay, so here we go. 70% of marine invertebrates have planktonic larvae. Most of the planktonic larvae are planktotrophic. Okay, planktotrophy equals patchy food and success rate. All right, so lecithotrophic, constant supply of food and higher larval success rate. But so the planktotrophic ones, they may not as many of the offspring may make it to settlement, and a lot of them may just be broadcast out and then die, but they produce a lot more of those babies. And then the lecithotrophic, it takes a lot more energy for the adult to produce a yolk sac as well as larva. Okay, so those are a few of the differences that you'll need to know about how marine organisms make their way compared to terrestrial organisms. And that concludes the first introductory lecture series. Next one, we'll be moving on to poriferans, which are sponges. Okay, see you there.